People observed pretty early on that the systems that make the work of mythology so important is that it seems to connect quite well to the way that people's lives are affected by it. And from A.B. Tyler saying that first and foremost among the causes which transfigure into myth the facts of daily experience is the belief in the animation of all nature rising at its highest pitch to personification. This, no occasional or hypothetical action of the mind, is inextricably bound in with that primitive mental state where man recognizes every detail of his world, the operation of personal life and will. So the myth is giving some kind of animation to nature and gives it the personality that is necessary for everything that is supernatural. In other words, by telling the story of how nature came to be according to some sort of believable format, then mythology gives us a pretty good picture of how life works. Now, that is our life as humans, of course, but also the life of the things around us. If we are going to think of animals and bugs or the mountains and the sea, thinking of these things as also being animated in some way by some kind of personified force, then we can also make sense of their own happening. So if a large storm comes in, then the god of the storm makes it move by a human movement and kind of shuffling the wind to make the wind come to us. And as we mentioned very early on in this class, A.B. Tyler was especially focusing on the what he called animism. And here, and so the, kind of a further definition of what he called animism, it is presently how animism, the doctrine of spiritual beings that once develops with and reacts upon mythic personification. In that early state of the human mind, which gives consistent individual life to phenomena that our utmost stretch of fancy only avails to personify in conscious metaphor, an idea of pervading life and will in nature far outside modern limits, a belief in personal souls animating even what we call inanimate bodies, a theory of transmigration of souls as well in life as after death, a sense of crowds of spiritual beings sometimes fitting through the air, but sometimes also inhabiting trees and rocks and waterfalls, and so lending their own personality to such material objects. All these thoughts work in mythology with such manifold coincidence as to make it hard indeed to unravel their separate action. So using this technique here of animism, Tyler is proposing a way to kind of connect things that are very difficult to connect otherwise. And mythology, in this context, telling us a story about these things is also meddling those different ideas into a more sensible format. Although that may sometimes make it more difficult to scientifically take them apart, as he points out here, hard indeed to unravel their separate action because what is the difference between a ghost or a spirit that is animating a forest and the forest kind of animating itself, especially once we run into issues of language and making sense of the translation of a ghost and a spirit and a soul. We've pointed out in this particular lecture that um, this particular class, I mean that the that soul and spirit have been used interchangeably by people who essentially did not have very high stakes in separating the two. Tyler himself was a very biased man, as we have pointed out before, and it is worth reminding ourselves right now. So his own biases would also become pretty problematic eventually. But we can still use this idea of animism as a point of beginning because Tyler did allow for the possibility of people who are not European to have some sort of claim to religion, which at the time was completely unknown. So by creating this idea of animism and kind of reversing it in the sense that we have done in this class, that is to point out that in a way, every form of religion is a form of animism, and there's no reason to classify those as inferior or superior to others, but rather to put them all on the same plane of applying those ideas of soul and supernatural, we can reach a much better understanding of exactly how these things work. And of course, in this context, Tyler is focusing himself on the soul. The soul indeed seems to be drawing in its outposts and concentrating itself on its first and main position, the doctrine of the human soul. This doctrine has undergone extreme modification in the course of culture. And this is something that we have mentioned before as well, the idea that soul is the thing that animates things, and those words come to us. That being said, Tyler pushes it even further by saying that the souls eventually turn into ideas, that the soul enters our body and by the operation of our brains turns into the thing that essentially drives us as having ideas about the world. So once we have a soul, we are also turned into these people who become immediately smarter. And of course, in the context that Tyler is speaking, the form of animism allows for that minimum of intelligence in people outside of his world, and certainly allows for the maximum amount of intelligence in the people in his world. Um, for us, we are especially looking at how we are able to use these supernatural objects as a force of nature, as essentially a thing that is allowing for other things to move. And in and of itself, this is, of course, part of our vocabulary as well. The fact that we are animating and the fact that an animal seems to have a soul, this is part of our broader understanding. This is part of a vocabulary we use. And in the sense that Tyler is not precluding the fact that somebody can have multiple souls, or cannot pushing limits to how the soul is working, this is certainly a much more useful concept than he probably even have thought of, because we are able to use this idea of soul as a kind of a multiple form of origin, and whether people are thinking of the souls as being unique or multiple, and whether the souls inhabit the brain or the heart or the world outside or the outer bodies of spirits and whatnot, we still have the possibility to make sense of how, culturally speaking, the understanding of the soul allows us a point of view into that culture and how different people have thought about this system working in their lives. And we could make those decisions on the similarity between different groups based on their own understanding of how the soul works. And that idea is very prevalent in most social sciences, and even especially in those early years from Lévi-Brühl that we have mentioned before. The life or external soul does not appear essentially different from the quote unquote vital principle. Soul and the kidney fat already studied. So Lévi-Brühl is connecting it with other formulations of the same idea. Vital principle is in Bergson, what he calls élan vital. Soul, of course, is what we have just talked about. The idea of a kidney fat is obviously a little bit more arcane. But if you have taken my other classes before, I talk about this in the early years of science. The ancient scientists tended to think that our life worked in a sort of a fluid that is passing through us, mostly based on the fact that we have blood, and losing your blood means that you are also dying. Here, the kidney fat is one of the forms of kind of again a thick blood that exists in people's minds, and that would allow for them to have a kind of this, again, this life juice, if you will, for lack of a better word, that would allow people to be alive, more alive, better alive through their operation on this kidney fat. And I kind of hate how I'm repeating this a lot, but you get the idea. Um, so the this really goes to people having a chance to grasp this unknown thing that allows us to work. And if at least we're working on a continuum where people think of their souls in different ways, think of their life juices in different ways, and program that into things that they can control. So maybe if your soul leaves your body, that means you're dead. Or maybe if you're sick, you're able to release the kidney fat or release the bad blood from your body, then you can be cured. Those things are very important to our mythologies. Again, the stories we tell about ourselves. So, like them, it is an essential appurtenance of the individual, but it may appear singular that for his greater security, the individual should himself remove from his person this principle, which by its presence alone maintains life. He places it elsewhere in a coffer, on a treetop, or on an animal in the most unlikely hiding places. Yet, the individual, in spite of the absence of his quote unquote life, continues to live. Even more, he regards his existence as more assured. He exposes himself boldly to the gravest dangers. So, if we are able to modify our soul and to change our soul and maybe use our soul in a way that saves us from problems, then it is quite possible to take that life outside of us to be better equipped to deal with the world, to deal with what is complicated. And in a sense, we are very commonly aware of how the souls may travel, that our souls may perhaps again when we die go into another body, maybe another person or another animal, in which case it is quite possible that our animal life be transferred into another animal life, and our motion, our sense of motion goes into something else, whether again it's a plant, a rock, or another animal. And Tyler pointed out, for example, that the idea of werewolves, especially, was something that was connected sometimes to a human soul. And he uses from a basis Herodotus, so Greek writer, legend of the Nuri, who turned every year for a few days to wolves. We follow the idea on Slavonic ground, where Livonian sorcerers bathe yearly in a river and turn for 12 days to wolves. And widespread Slavonic superstition still declares that the wolves that sometimes in bitter winters dare to attack men are themselves Vigolak, men bewitched into wolf shape. The modern Greeks, instead of the classic lycanthropos, so lycanthropy, the werewolf, adopt the Slavonic term Vigolakas. Um, so it's werewolf, but in Slavonic. If it is a man who falls into a cataleptic state while his soul enters a wolf and goes ravening for blood. Modern Germany, especially in the north, still keeps up the stories of the wolf girdles, and in December you must not quote unquote talk of the wolf by name lest the werewolves tear you. So here again, mention the bad guy's name, then the bad guy comes to you. Same thing with Candyman. The same thing comes with um, you know other mythical creatures. Our English word werewolf, that is man-wolf, the werewolf of Knut's laws, still reminds us of the old belief in our own country, and it has had for centuries but little place in English folklore. This has been not so much for lack of superstition as of wolves. So, werewolves apparently fell out of fashion sometimes in the 19th century, mostly because people didn't see wolves anymore, and so it might not have been relevant for them to see wolves. At least that's what he thinks, because if you have ever seen a werewolf movie today, or if you're aware of this, chances are you have never seen a wolf in real life either. So, there is something more than just the natural experience, just that firsthand knowledge of how things work that could perhaps make sense out of this. And you could perhaps think of it as why the werewolves exist. If they are here to drink our blood, to attack us, to eat our meat, those things are probably the more important features of the werewolves. But we're not talking about werewolves yet. We're talking more generally about how the soul can travel from one place to the other, and especially in the context that we think of the soul in kind of this hazy way. As I mentioned, it becomes a real issue in terms of cross-cultural understanding, because different people have different understanding of those words. Here, kind of a part of a broader question in the way that Freud uses the word psyche, and today we have used that word psyche as as the official understanding of how psychiatry and psychoanalysis works. But Freud himself, being not a big fan of religion, generally speaking, was very carefully avoiding to talk about the soul because it was too laden of a religious term. That being said, he still had to use it for specific forms, and this particular extract here is presenting Freud's idea about the soul with the German words associated to be able to make sense of how those things work, because depending on who was translating Freud, they might have taken some liberties, including using the word soul to transcribe psyche, which is not necessarily um, the most applicable translation, and more generally speaking, yeah, not the thing that uh, uh, Margaret that Freud was implying. Human beings found themselves obliged in general to recognize intellectual geistige, so Geist being kind of a ghost, forces that is, which cannot be grasped by the senses, particularly by the sight, but which nonetheless produce undoubted and indeed extremely powerful effects. If we may rely upon the evidence of language, it was movement of the air that provided the prototype of intellectuality, Geistigkeit, for intellect, Geist, derives its um, name from the breath of the wind, animus, spirit, and the Hebrew ruach, breath. This too led to the discovery of the mind, seal, soul, in German, Seele, um, as that of the intellectual Geistigen principle in individual human beings. Taking a break here. So Geist, this is where we get the idea of ghost from, and of course here this is the intellect. So a ghost being maybe an intellectual soul. I mean, not clear. The thing that moves people. Again, this is a Geist or intellect or animus, which would be translated as soul in Latin, or spiritus, maybe spirit, and ruach being breath in Hebrew. Observation found the movement of air once again in men's breathing, which ceases when they die. To this day, a dying man breathes his spirit, Seele. Now, however, the world of spirits, Geisterreich, lay open to men that were prepared to attribute the soul, Seele, which they had discovered in themselves, to everything in nature. The whole world was animate, bezielt, that is, be sold, and science, which came much so later, had plenty to do in divesting part of the world of its soul once more. Indeed, it has not been completed to task even today. So, if we think of psychoanalysis and psychology generally as a science of the soul, and not the animism that Taylor was proposing, but kind of the modern version of the soul, when soul Freud when Freud uses the word psyche to use soul, he is really referring to a process that is, again, very animistic in a sense, not associated with the particular soul that exists in Christianity. And so the better known versions of Freud's theories and Freud's ideas, for example, what people tend to call the ego, the id, and the superego, are somewhat translated because in German it works out to the I, the it, and the above I, or I can't remember what order I said that, but the ego being I, the id being it, and the superego being above I. Um, using this idea of the soul as an intellect here is really confusing to understand Freud and to make sense out of Freud is talking about, because if we are talking about the intellect, that is this reasonable form of thinking, obviously we are kind of excluding the aspect of belief, the aspect of the supernatural. So making sense of this integration of the more abstract thinking with the more logical thinking was very much Freud's role, and eventually, of course, becomes much more interesting to our understanding of culture. There's another layer of complications with that. Once Jung comes to play, Jung was working with Freud for a while and then breaks away from him. And I've mentioned Jung before, who was very important in the understanding of what is conscious, and especially unconscious or subconscious. Jung's organizing the world into psychological types and whatnot. So, the references to Jung are even more arcane in this regard, especially because Jung himself didn't have much much concrete research. So he had a lot of big ideas about a lot of things, but not much of an application for them. So looking at the soul as a principle that allows us to move is really the simplest way in which we can make sense out of this, knowing that of course it can get a lot more complicated to the point of transforming it in a science itself.